Question one talks about the is on the topic of how monetary policy might be able to return the economy quickly to the potential growth rate after a shock, and we're given an equation down below: n plus v equals inflation plus real growth. Part A would consider the nation of Kidland before the shock to the economy: m equals 10, v equals 3, and real growth equals 4. What would inflation be? We can set the equation to inflation equals n plus v minus real growth. So 10 plus 3 equals 13 minus 4 is 9, so inflation would be 9%. In Kidland, v falls to 0, but m stays the same. In the long run, what would inflation and real growth equal? In the long run, the real growth rate would return back to normal, so real growth equal 4. However, that would mean that inflation would be taking the brunt of the change, so inflation would go from 9 to 6%. Part C, consider the nation of Prescotia. Before the shock, m equals 2, v equals 4, and real growth equals 2. What would inflation be? 2 plus 4 is 6, and 6 minus 2, which is the real growth rate, would equal 4, so inflation would equal 4%. And in Prescotia, with the shock, v rises to 8%. In the long run, what would inflation equal? What would real growth equal? Real growth equal 2, which is the normal, which was the previous rate, but then inflation would increase to 8%. And part E, we consider the nation of Friedmania. Before the shock, m equals 3, v equals 0, and real growth equals 3. What was inflation? 3 plus 0 is 3, 3 minus 3 is 0, so inflation would equal 0%. Friedmania, m falls to 1%. In the long run, what would inflation and real growth equal? As I said before, real growth would equal 2%, and while inflation would equal negative 2%. Part 2, we reviewed the quantity theorem, which is a theory that shows how the economy is fixed itself in the long run. And part A, we're asked to show what would happen if the consumers and investors became more optimistic. By that time, the aggregate demand curve would have to move up and to the right to illustrate their optimism. The purple line shows the change where the high aggregate demand inflation rate would be, while the yellow curve would show where high AD real growth would be. As you see, they have increased. And if the central banker saw this rise, she wants to reverse it with monetary policy. If she does it just right, that means that the red line would go back to the blue line, meaning that it returns back to normal. And the high inflation rate and the real growth rate will return back to normal, which is where the two blue lines and the green line intersect. And if she does her job just right, what will the inflation be? As we said in the beginning, it's in part A, it was said that the inflation rate was 10%, so it would return back to 10%. Part 3, we want to show the effect of the potential growth shock of the long run aggregate supply curve. That would mean that the light green line will have to move to the right, where we see, which is the dark green line, which is illustrated by the new LRAS text box. And we see that the new SRAS curve would also move down and to the right to show to where the AD line and the new LRAS line intersect as well. Have they kept AD fixed? As a result, the real growth would be higher since it's moving to the right. However, the inflation rate would be lower since it's moving down. If the central bank wanted to return inflation to its old level, it has to raise money growth. With money growth, you have more money in the supply, and so inflation would be raised. However, if it wants to return real growth to its old level, it has to reduce the money supply in order for that to work. And part E, economists say that central bankers face a cruel trade-off between inflation and real growth when a potential growth shock hits. This is just illustrated by part C and D. We see that in order to return inflation, we have to increase the money supply. However, if we want to return the real growth back to its old level, we have to reduce the money supply. So since we can't do both at the same time, they have to decide if they want inflation to go back to its old level, or do they want real growth to be back to its old level. They have to decide which one is better off. Hence the cruel trade-off.
In question 4, we're asked about discerning between rules and discretions. Since we know that rules are more set-in-stone policies and discretions involve using judgment, we can apply those definitions to the following examples. So, Congress setting an automatic increase in Social Security cost of living is a rule because it's going to increase the same as it has been until they change the law. Congress going to a vote to decide the number is, however, a discretion because the legislators are using their own judgment to decide what the number should be. Similarly, the Taylor rule is a hard and fast calculation to follow, so it's a rule, while the idea of just doing what seems right at the time is discretion. For Part E, the officer is using their own judgment to tell if a character is acting suspiciously, so it's discretionary, while the policy in Part F leaves the judgment out, as anyone wearing bulky clothes that could hide a weapon should be stopped, regardless of how suspicious they look, so it's a rule. Moving to question 5, we are asked to draw a graph of when the Fed's assumption is lower than actual aggregate demand. So in the graph to the right, we can see that the red line marks the aggregate demand that the Fed assumes, while the green line shows the actual aggregate demand. because of the negative shock. In order to try to combat that shock, the Fed does what they need to do to increase aggregate demand by 10%, which yields the next graph, where the red line is where they expect the aggregate demand curve to lie, while the green line shows where it actually is. In the short-term amount of time after this reaction, real growth will increase a little bit, as will inflation. In the long term, however, we know that expansionary monetary policy can only lay the groundwork for increasing real growth rather than actually causing it. So inflation grows long term while real growth doesn't as a result of this scenario.
Question 6. Which of the following would be methods that the Fed could use to maintain market confidence when a negative aggregate demand shock hits? We chose C. The Fed will promise to increase the growth rate of money if the economy worsens further. This is because the aggregate demand shifts left, causing the general price level and real GDP to decline. So people lose faith in markets and may cause a recession through inaction unless they have that assurance from the government that the growth rate is fast enough to make up for the losses. Question 7. It talks about the distinction between policies that work in theory and in practice. And the example is 6 episodes of economic growth slowing by the government intentionally after World War II. And it was meant to curb the effects of rapid inflation. So we said it worked most of the time, but some of the contractions were potentially non-beneficial. The consensus is that the inflation was slowed and it was used credibly most of the time, so that helped prevent a rapid increase in inflation and save the economy, but it wasn't all useful.
For question 8, we're given 2 equations, one of which is for AD money growth, and the second one is for inflation. Now for part A, if we plug in the values into the equation for money growth, we see that the inflation plus real growth is going to be 10% plus 3%, which is going to be 13%. For part B, we'll first work out the potential growth rate by using the inflation equation, and that is going to be 3%. And now if we plug that into the new money growth, AD inflation, where now the inflation is 4%, and the real growth is, we're assuming potential growth, that is 3%, that's going to give us 7% for the money growth. Now, instead of looking at the long run, in part C, we want to look at the short run. In the short run, we know the money growth, we know it, the expected inflation, and now we have 2 equations forming a system. Plugging the values in, we discover that the inflation is going to be 7% and the real growth is going to be 0%. For the first part of question 9, which is part A, we are using the same premise, but instead we now have a steeper SRAS, where the coefficient in front of real growth rate minus potential growth rate is going to be 2. And so plugging all the answers in, we see that now we have the inflation of 6% and the real growth of 1% instead of 0. That should indicate that the steeper slope indicates a higher real growth. And now instead of using 2 in part B of this question, we're going to use 100, which is a much steeper slope. And plugging all the values in again, we see inflation is 4.1 and real growth is now 2.9, which is really close to the potential growth rate. Looking at part C, we see that we would prefer a steeper SRAS, such as 100, 300, even 500, because as we've seen in previous questions, a steeper SRAS brings up the real growth and makes it approach the potential growth rate. For question 10, we want to see in each of the 3 scenarios, which of the following 4 are going to be predictable. So a fall in inflation, a rise in inflation, a fall in real growth, or a rise in real growth. By drawing an AD or potential curve graph, we see that for scenario A, there is going to be a fall in real growth for certain, for B, there's going to be a rise in inflation, and for C, there's going to be a rise in real growth.